What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Over the last 24 hours, Russia-Ukraine war produced a set of developments that, when examined together rather than individually, begin to tell a deeper story about where this conflict might be heading in the coming months. On the surface, the headlines appear unrelated. Russia is still slowly expanding its control in parts of eastern Ukraine. European leaders are warning Washington not to pressure Kyiv into territorial concessions. Energy prices are climbing due to rising tensions in the Middle East, for obvious reasons. And a surprising development far away from the front line, a Russian tanker in the Mediterranean Sea suddenly caught on fire, under circumstances, well, guess what, that are still being investigated. But when you step back and connect these dots, something far more strategic begins to emerge. Russia, for example, may be making incremental territorial gains on the battlefield, yet those gains are happening at a pace that raises serious questions about its sustainability, how long they can do it. At the same time, global developments from energy markets to geopolitical pressure inside Europe itself are all quietly reshaping the strategic environment around the war itself. And perhaps most revealing of them all, the Kremlin itself is now taking steps that suggest deep strains inside the Russian system, including a surprising decision to recruit war veterans into a police force to fill a massive domestic staffing shortage. And yet they still claim that we don't have problems with the personnel. So today, let's break down 7 of the most important developments from the past 24 hours, starting with the debate about Russia's territorial progress, then moving directly to the latest frontline updates from the Institute for the Study of War, before exploring how global energy prices, internal Russian politics, and European diplomatic pressure are all beginning to influence the direction of the conflict. And when you look at all these pieces together, the real question becomes the following. Are we watching a war that is stabilizing, or a war that is slowly entering a new and even more complicated phase? Guys, let's try to answer this question in today's episode. At first glance, recent headlines about Russia's territorial advances might give the impression that Moscow is steadily moving forward and slowly grinding down Ukrainian defenses. Several analyses, including a recent opinion piece in the Washington Post, point out that Russia has indeed managed to expand its control in certain areas over the past year. The advance has not been dramatic, but it has been, at least for them, I guess, measurable. However, the real story becomes much more complicated once you look at the scale of these gains relative to the cost required to achieve them. For example, Russia has spent months conducting continuous offensive operations across several sectors of the eastern front line, deploying large numbers of personnel and equipment in an attempt to maintain pressure along multiple axes. And yet, despite all these efforts, the territorial changes have remained extremely limited when measured against the total length of the front line, which once again stretches for hundreds if not thousands of miles across eastern and southern Ukraine. In many areas, the battlefield has begun to resemble a slow, grinding contest of endurance rather than a rapidly evolving campaign. Positions shift slightly here and there, but the overall strategic map changes very slowly. If you zoom out, you're most likely not even gonna see anything. And this dynamic creates a fascinating strategic paradox. On one hand, Russia can point to incremental gains and argue that its long-term strategy of attrition is working. But on the other hand, those gains are arriving at a pace that raises serious questions about how long such approach can be sustained without creating major pressure inside Russia itself. Because wars of attrition are not just about territory, they are also about economics, manpower, and political endurance. Every kilometer gained requires resources, equipment, and personnel, and the longer the war continues, the more difficult it becomes to maintain the same level of operational intensity without creating strain somewhere else in the system. And this brings us directly to the next major development, because if we want to understand whether Russia's current strategy can actually continue producing results or not, we just need to look at what is happening right now along the front lines. So let's take a closer look at the latest battlefield assessment from probably one of the most respectable independent military analysts on the internet, from the Institute for the Study of War. And then we're going to explore what the situation on the ground really looks like in today's next chapter. By the way, speaking about the front lines, if you want to see some combat footage I was able to find, please feel free to check my Patreon, because that is the only place where I can upload and show to you guys this kind of stuff. The link is down below. Thanks so much. Let's continue. So yeah, according to the latest assessment from the Institute for the Study of War, the frontline situation remains highly active, but also remarkably stable in strategic terms. Russian forces, what I mean by that, continue to conduct offensive operations across multiple sectors of eastern Ukraine, particularly in the areas around Donetsk and Luhansk regions. These operations involve repeated attempts to pressure Ukrainian defensive positions through sustained assaults, often also focusing on localized objectives rather than large-scale breakthroughs. What analysts from these media are observing is not a rapid offensive designed to achieve sudden operational collapse, but rather a slow and methodical approach intended to gradually weaken Ukrainian defensive networks over time. And this type of strategy relies on persistence. I mean, that's why it's called the war of attrition, right? Because instead of trying to achieve decisive breakthroughs in a short period of time, Russian commanders appear to be pursuing a campaign that aims to exhaust Ukrainian forces through continuous pressure. But guess what? This approach also has two very important limitations. First, it requires enormous logistical support, because maintaining offensive operations across such a long front line requires a constant flow of equipment, ammunition, and personnel replacements and rotations. And then second, it depends heavily on time. A slow strategy only works if the political and economic environment surrounding the war remains stable enough to support it for years rather than months. And as you can see, that is exactly where global events begin to matter. Because the war in Ukraine does not just exist in isolation, it's not just between Russia and Ukraine. It is influenced by international energy markets, political debates inside Europe and the United States, and even events taking place thousands of miles away in the Middle East. Which brings us to the next development, where Russian political voices are now calling for the dramatic escalation of the war in response to developments far beyond Ukraine itself. And, well, you guessed it, it happened. Whatever is happening in Iran is to blame. And to understand why that is happening, we need to look at what Russian hardliners are currently demanding from the Kremlin, potentially from the Putin himself. Inside Russia, a group of influential political commentators and nationalist figures are now arguing that the war in Ukraine should be expanded rather than stabilized. According to reports, some of these voices believe that recent geopolitical developments, particularly the escalation of tensions involving, obviously once again, Iran, create an opportunity for Russia to intensify its campaign in Ukraine. And the logic behind this argument is, well, relatively straightforward. Well, I mean, just you hear this and let me know if you agree or not. If global attention becomes focused on other crises, such as the instability in the Middle East, what we have right now, then the war in Ukraine might receive way less political attention in Western capitals. And if that happens, Russian hardliners believe it could create a strategic window for Moscow to increase military pressure. Unfortunately, makes sense, right? This argument does not necessarily mean that the Kremlin is preparing an immediate escalation, but it does reveal something very important about the internal debate taking place inside Russia. There are factions within the Russian political establishment that believe that the war should be expanded, not reduced. And this internal pressure adds another layer of complexity to the strategic environment surrounding the conflict, because decisions about war are rarely shaped by military considerations alone. They are also influenced by political pressures, domestic expectations, and the balance of power among different functions inside the government itself, and not just once again in Russia or Ukraine. And this also internal debate inside once again Russia becomes even more interesting when we consider the next development, because global events are already beginning to influence the financial environment that supports the war. Let's explore how rising energy prices could unexpectedly reshape Russia's economic situation and what that might mean for the future of the whole conflict. Before we proceed, guys, if you like this style of daily, quick news updates, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps the algorithm to push our content to more people, and it's all thanks to you. Much appreciated. Now let's continue. One of the most important economic variables influencing the war in Ukraine is the price of the energy, particularly oil. Russia remains one of the world's largest exporters of oil and natural gas, and fluctuations in global energy prices can have a direct impact on the country's ability to finance prolonged military operations. And then, recent reports indicate that rising tensions in the Middle East have begun pushing global energy prices upward. So, while higher energy prices can create economic challenges for many countries, they can also produce a surprising side effect when it comes to Russia and, other oil producers. And, the reason is pretty obvious, it's pretty simple. Just think about it. Higher prices mean that every barrel of oil sold on the international markets generates more revenue. But that's pretty much it, that's the whole argument. But, just hold a second. This does not mean Russia suddenly becomes economically comfortable. Sanctions and restrictions, they still limit the country's ability to fully benefit from global energy markets. But higher prices can partially offset some of these constraints by increasing the total revenue generated from the energy exports. In other words, events far outside Ukraine can quietly influence the financial foundations of the war. And that brings us to the very unusual development that took place far from the battlefield, in the Mediterranean Sea. And once again, Russian oil tanker is the centerpiece of the whole event. Reports emerged recently that a Russian tanker experienced a sudden fire while operating in the Mediterranean Sea. The circumstances surrounding the incident remain obviously unclear, but early reports suggested that the possibility of a naval drone attack happened. If confirmed, such an incident would represent another example of how modern warfare is expanding beyond traditional front lines, because during this entire conflict, Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated its ability to conduct operations that reach far beyond the immediate battlefield. From long-range drone operations to maritime innovations, all these capabilities have gradually reshaped the strategic environment of this war. And incidents like this illustrate a very important point. The geography of the conflict is no longer limited strictly to Ukraine itself, not even bordering regions, but almost the entire world. The ripple effects of the war can now be observed across multiple regions, including water routes and international energy infrastructure. But the military dimension of the only one side of the story. The political dimension is also equally important to take into consideration, which leads us directly to the next major development involving European leaders and their concerns about the future direction of Western policy towards Ukraine. A major diplomatic signal emerged from Europe when German Chancellor Friedrich Merz reportedly warned that Ukraine should not be pressured into giving up additional territory in negotiations. This message appears to be directed not only at Moscow, but also at policymakers in Washington, because it reflects growing concern among European leaders that any attempt to push Ukraine towards territorial concessions could create long-term instability in Europe itself. Because, we can understand them, right? From their perspective, allowing territorial changes achieved through military force could set a dangerous precedent for the future security architecture of the continent. And this debate highlights a crucial issue that will likely shape the next phase of the war. The question is how the West defines success. Is success measured purely in terms of battlefield outcomes, or is it defined by broader political principles such as sovereignty and territorial integrity? Different governments may answer that question differently, and that is precisely why diplomatic discussions about the war have become almost as important as military developments on the ground. But perhaps the most revealing development of the past 24 hours comes from the inside Russia itself, because the Kremlin is now taking a step that reveals significant internal strain within the country, something what no amount of propaganda can ever spin otherwise. Let's talk about it in our final chapter. Reports indicate that Russian authorities are now encouraging war veterans to join the police force in order to address a major staffing shortage inside the country's law enforcement system. According to available estimates, Russia may currently face a shortage of more than 200,000 police officers, So I mean, without a doubt, this development definitely illustrates the fascinating consequences of this prolonged military conflict, including that it has effects on Russia itself. Large-scale mobilization and continuous recruitment for the armed forces can create unexpected gaps in other parts of the state apparatus, because when large numbers of working-age men are directed towards military service, other sectors of the workforce begin to feel the impact, and some of them almost immediately. And then this creates a complicated balancing act for governments trying to sustain long conflicts, such as that they must maintain sufficient manpower for the military, while also ensuring that essential domestic institutions continue functioning properly. Which is exactly why this policy of recruiting veterans into police roles may represent more than just a short-term staffing solution. It may also reflect the long-term social effects of the war that has now entered its 5th year. So, when you look at all these developments together, the slow territorial changes on the battlefield, the continued pressure along the front lines, the influence of global energy markets, rising geopolitical tensions, European diplomatic signals, and even staffing shortages inside Russia, one thing becomes crystal clear. The war in Ukraine is not frozen. If anything, it is only evolving in very unusual and very unpredictable ways. I mean, just who could have thought that an attack against Putin's supposed ally can actually help him to increase the intensity in Ukraine? And the direction of that evolution will likely be shaped not just by events on the battlefield, but also by global politics of different countries, economics, and internal pressures inside the countries once again involved. So guys, if you found today's daily briefing useful and want to stay updated on the biggest developments shaping this conflict, please make sure to subscribe, because we will continue following these stories and try to make these updates as many as daily as possible, exploring the deeper strategic trends behind the headlines. Don't forget about bonus content on Patreon, the link is down below. Thanks so much for watching, see you tomorrow.